The sweet yet condescending voice of the flight attendant echoed through the first-class cabin. "I'm sorry, sir, but this seat has been reserved for one of our regular VIPs. I need you to move." Her name was Amanda, the lead flight attendant, with a polite smile and cold eyes. Standing in front of her was a black man, Thomas Bell, calmly seated in 2A. Thomas wore a simple but sharp suit, quietly scrolling through emails on his tablet. He looked up, mildly confused. "Excuse me, but this is the seat I booked, and I'm a Diamond member." He spoke with calm authority, presenting his membership card along with a boarding pass that clearly showed his seat number. Behind Amanda stood Evelyn Monroe, a white woman dressed in designer clothing, clutching an expensive leather handbag, tapping her diamond-studded watch impatiently. "I always sit there," Evelyn muttered just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "It's basically my seat at this point." The atmosphere in the cabin began to shift. Heads turned. Curious eyes glanced in Thomas's direction, the only person in the scene who wasn't tense. But he knew exactly what was happening. He had witnessed situations like this before. And every time, he had swallowed his pride and let it slide. But this time, something in his eyes sparked. This time, he wasn't going to move. Amanda glanced at Evelyn before lowering her voice, her tone still coated in false courtesy. "I'm sure you'd be more comfortable in a different seat. This one is typically for guests with a higher travel profile." Her words were sugar-coated, but the meaning cut deep, not into his body, but into his dignity. No one around them yet realized that the man they were trying to quietly dismiss was no ordinary passenger. In a matter of minutes, this one act of prejudice would spiral into a career-ending catastrophe for the entire flight crew. Thomas remained seated, his expression calm, as if he'd grown accustomed to suspicion. He wasn't angry, but there was a firmness in his tone that made Amanda hesitate. "I've already shown my membership card and my boarding pass. This is my seat, and I'm not moving." Passengers nearby began to pay closer attention. A few discreetly pulled out their phones to start recording. Nobody said anything, but the discomfort on their faces was clear. The atmosphere inside the luxurious first-class cabin suddenly felt tight, like a string pulled too far. Amanda forced a tight smile, but her lips were pressed so hard they were nearly trembling. At that moment, the cabin supervisor, Brian, stepped in. He walked with the confidence of someone used to being obeyed. "Sir," Brian said loudly, making sure everyone could hear, "this seat is typically reserved for long-time elite passengers. We need you to relocate immediately." Thomas looked up, locking eyes with the supervisor. "I booked this seat. I'm a Diamond member. I have every right to sit here just like anyone else," he replied clearly. Brian narrowed his eyes, his tone growing impatient. "Maybe you're not familiar with how we operate at Skylux, but certain guests hold special privileges. If you don't cooperate, this could get more complicated than it needs to be." The situation had now crossed the line of a simple seating dispute. The cabin was tense, waiting for someone to snap. A woman across the aisle subtly tilted her phone to record what was happening. Evelyn, still standing in the aisle, added fuel to the fire with a loud complaint. "This is ridiculous. I take this flight every month, and that's always been my seat. I have an important meeting after landing." In the chaos, no one seemed to notice the moment Evelyn stepped closer to Amanda and slipped a small envelope into the attendant's blazer pocket. "Thanks for handling this," Evelyn whispered, just loud enough for a few nearby passengers to hear. That single moment, a subtle bribe, transformed the entire situation into something far more damning. Clear, documented discrimination in exchange for cash. Amanda gave a polite nod as if saying thank you, then turned away quickly, avoiding the eyes around her. Thomas said nothing, but he had seen it. He didn't need to react, not yet. Quietly, he pulled out his phone, placed it on his lap, and began recording everything. An older man nearby shook his head slowly. A young woman whispered to her seatmate, "I think they're kicking him out just because of his skin color." What the crew didn't realize was that in just a few hours, everything they were doing, every word, every gesture, would be seen by millions, and the consequences would be more severe than they could possibly imagine. Silence gripped the cabin as Brian, the flight supervisor, leaned in close to Thomas. His voice low but laced with threat. "We can do this the easy way, or we can make it unpleasant. The choice is yours." The words hung in the air like a veiled threat. But everyone understood what he meant. All eyes turned to Thomas, the black man still seated, still calm. But this time, he didn't smile. "I'm not moving," Thomas said firmly. "This is the seat I paid for." 6 words. 6 words that would bring an entire airline to its knees. Brian flushed red. He spun on his heel and walked briskly toward the front of the plane. Grabbing the cabin phone, passengers began whispering, some tapping rapidly on their phones, live streaming the situation. No one could have guessed that what began as a seating dispute would soon explode into a global media storm. 5 minutes later, the cockpit door opened. Captain Raymond Cole stepped out, tall, seasoned, and stern. He walked down the aisle with Brian and Amanda following closely behind. "Sir, I understand there's been a situation," the captain began in a controlled, authoritative voice. "Our crew is authorized to reassign seats when necessary for passenger comfort and safety." Thomas looked up. 3 people standing, 1 sitting. But the true power dynamic was already shifting. "I have a valid boarding pass. I'm a Diamond member, and I chose this seat for work purposes," he replied steadily. "There's no policy requiring me to give up my seat just because someone else wants it." Brian interrupted with a smug smile. "If you continue to be uncooperative, we'll have to ask security to escort you off the plane." That sentence dropped like a stone in water, sending ripples through the cabin. Thomas looked directly at the captain. "You're threatening to remove me because I won't give up the seat I paid for. Is that correct?" Before the captain could respond, Evelyn's voice cut through the tension. "This is outrageous. I'm going to miss my connection. I've never been treated this poorly in my life." The irony was lost on no one. The person being forcibly removed was calm, respectful, and in the right, while the one demanding the seat was shouting, "Entitled," and white. Thomas reached slowly into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He opened the camera and began recording. "I'm documenting this for my own safety," he said, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "I'm being removed from this flight for not giving up my rightful seat to a white woman." Brian snapped, reaching toward the phone. "Recording isn't allowed." Thomas pulled back slightly. "There's no federal law prohibiting recording on a flight unless it interferes with crew duties. I know my rights." At that moment, 2 airport security officers boarded the plane. They followed Brian's directions and walked straight to Thomas's seat. The cabin was dead silent. Even the usual hum of the plane seemed to fade. "Sir, we've been asked to escort you off the flight," one officer said. Thomas nodded once, acknowledging them without a trace of panic. "I'd like to understand which policy I'm violating," he asked clearly. "I have a valid ticket and a proper boarding pass." The officers glanced at each other, visibly uncomfortable. "You're being removed for causing a disturbance," the captain muttered weakly. An elderly man shook his head from the second row. A young woman dabbed her eyes with a tissue. Thomas packed up slowly, closed his tablet, and slipped his documents into his briefcase. His posture was upright, his steps steady. The walk of a man who had faced discrimination before and knew exactly how to carry his dignity through it. As he passed Brian in the aisle, something happened that would later go viral. Evelyn, thinking no one noticed, slipped another folded bill into Brian's pocket and whispered, "Thanks for handling that. First class should have standards." Those around them, including several recording passengers, captured it all. Once off the plane, Thomas texted his COO. They picked the wrong person to humiliate. While most people might have crumbled, Thomas was calm, composed, and already mobilizing his legal team. Moments later, a young woman who had followed him off the flight approached, holding her phone. "I recorded everything," she said, "from the moment they first approached you until they forced you off. And I'm willing to testify if needed." Thomas gave a small, appreciative nod. This wasn't the first time he'd faced injustice, but this time, he wasn't alone, and soon, the whole world would be watching. Just hours after Thomas was escorted off the plane, the video capturing the entire incident spread like wildfire across social media. Millions of views, hundreds of thousands of angry comments, hashtags like #justice for Thomas and #Skylux discrimination began trending worldwide. No one could have imagined that the man removed for being disruptive was, in fact, one of the most powerful tech CEOs in the world. At Skylux Airlines headquarters, an emergency meeting was called. CEO Richard Campbell sat silently, watching the viral footage, Amanda taking money from Evelyn, Thomas being forced off the plane. His face turned pale as the name was read aloud. "What's the passenger's name again?" he asked the communications director. "Thomas Bell, sir," the director replied quietly. "Wait, Thomas Bell? As in Novatech's Thomas Bell?" Campbell's voice caught in his throat. Novatech, the very company Skylux had been negotiating with for a $50 million partnership to overhaul their outdated customer systems. Meanwhile, in a private airport lounge, Thomas sat calmly with his legal and executive team. He didn't say much, just opened his laptop and reviewed the events with quiet focus. Then his phone rang. Richard Campbell was calling. "Mr. Bell, I'd like to personally offer our deepest apologies. We had no idea who you were," Campbell said, voice strained. Thomas replied, calm as ever. "And that's exactly why you made the mistake." That same day, Skylux convened a shareholder emergency meeting. Thomas arrived wearing the same suit he was wearing when he was removed from the flight, a subtle but powerful reminder. He didn't need to raise his voice. He simply played the video, Brian issuing threats, Amanda's silence, the captain's indifference, and most damning of all, Evelyn's money changing hands. "I'm not here for apologies," Thomas said, his voice cool but cutting. "I'm here for accountability." His demands were non-negotiable: immediate termination of all staff involved, cancellation of the $50 million tech contract, and if they failed to act, he and his partners, holding 25% of Skylux shares, would withdraw their investments. A move that would tank the company's stock. Just then, a young analyst burst into the boardroom with a tablet in hand. "The stock has already dropped over 12%, he announced breathlessly. "Analysts predict it could fall 30% if we don't act now." With nowhere left to run, Skylux's leadership caved. Thomas's terms were accepted in full. In a separate internal meeting, Brian, Amanda, and Captain Raymond were informed of their immediate termination. No negotiation, no severance beyond 2 weeks. Amanda wept. Brian argued loudly, insisting he had only followed protocol. But when shown the footage of Evelyn slipping cash into his pocket, his voice fell silent. Meanwhile, hundreds of Skylux employees were gathered in the company's main auditorium. CEO Richard Campbell stepped onto the stage and declared, "Today, we failed a passenger. Tomorrow, we begin our transformation." And at the center of that transformation stood the man they once believed didn't belong in a first-class seat, Thomas Bell. Just days after the incident, Skylux Airlines made an unprecedented announcement, a 48-hour suspension of all flights, during which every employee, from pilots to baggage handlers, would undergo mandatory training in bias awareness, equity, and conflict resolution. The program was developed and led by Novatech, the very company owned by Thomas Bell. This wasn't about punishment, it was about transforming from within. Gone were the lifeless corporate lectures. Instead, employees were immersed in real-world simulations, where they played the roles of those discriminated against, the bystanders, or even the ones making the wrong calls. And at the front of each training session stood Thomas Bell himself. He wasn't angry, he wasn't there for revenge. He entered every room not as a victim, but as someone offering a second chance. Justice isn't about punishment, Thomas told one session. It's about accountable change. We can't build a fairer society if we don't give people the opportunity to make things right. Months passed, and the results were more visible than anyone expected. Passenger satisfaction scores soared. Travelers who had long felt overlooked due to their appearance, accent, or skin color were now being treated with equal care and respect. Skylux wasn't just recovering, it was becoming a model for what a truly inclusive airline could look like. At a moving press conference, Thomas Bell announced a bold new initiative, the Second Chance program, a rehabilitation path for employees who had been fired due to discriminatory actions, provided they demonstrated sincere understanding and a commitment to change. To everyone's surprise, Brian, Amanda, and Captain Raymond, the very individuals who once humiliated Thomas, became the first to complete the program. Not to erase the past, but to earn back their integrity as people who now understood, more than anyone, the cost of ignoring prejudice. At the close of the event, Thomas stepped forward and said one final line, simple, clear, and unforgettable. You don't need power to demand respect. You just need to know your worth, and never back down.